All right, so what we'll do in this lecture is to talk about the not so much the American Revolution. I think you get a good sense of that with the six-part series that I've uploaded to Blackboard. Again, it's not necessary that you watch all six parts. That's about 300 minutes in total in length, but the six episodes measuring about 50 minutes apiece. You can kind of gauge those as far as your understanding of the revolution and kind of refresh your memory, as I mentioned in the description, as to where you want to focus your attention. So it's kind of up to you as far as where you need maybe some more information or context with regard to the American Revolution itself. What I want to do in this segment, however, is to focus attention on the post war era, basically looking at the early efforts for the United States to establish its own governing authority. That being the case in the creation of the Articles of Confederation, as well as the reorganization into a new form of government under the guidelines, the kind of template of the U.S. Constitution. So that's where what we'll talk about at length here and now. So with the Articles of Confederation, really during the entirety of much of the American Revolution itself, um, and again, these are the slides associated with the the American Revolution, but also the what we'll cover here in this segment. Again, just some key turning points of the Battle of Trenton and Battle of Princeton, kind of the domestic turning points of the American Revolution, but then also the Battle of Saratoga being that key victory, U.S. victory or American victory, in which France enters the war as an ally of the American states. But here we are turning attention towards the Articles of Confederation. So during the war, the Second Continental Congress had served for all intents and purposes as the governing authority of the colonies in their rebellion. They had, of course, declared independence. They had raised an army. They had issued a currency. They had borrowed money from overseas lenders, including not only France, but also the Dutch Republic as well. They had negotiated treaties and created this alliance with France in 1778. And this was all done really without clear authority stating that they had that the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, had a right to do so. This Congress also went on to establish the world's, or excuse me, the country's first government of the United States itself by drafting the Articles of Confederation. This agreement proclaimed the sovereignty and independence of each state, 13 states in all, of course. Political power under the Confederation of the Articles of Confederation separated authority between the Congress and the states. That there would be no separate executive branch within the under the terms of this new agreement of the government. Congress maintained the common defense on behalf of the states, and they also assumed control over the western lands that could be distributed according to the Congress's wishes. In fact, states without Western claims refused to actually ratify the Articles of Confederation until Western claims had been, turned over and fallen under the jurisdiction of the Congress itself. States like Maryland, for example. To enact any new legislative proposals, 9 of the 13 states had to agree to make those proposals effective. And they could not levy taxes or regulate trade between the states. That is to say that the Congress could not navigate or kind of regulate trade or taxation of the states themselves. So the states had a good deal of power unto themselves. They were the ones responsible for levying their own taxes. State representatives to serve in Congress served a term of 1 year, and representatives could serve a maximum of 3 years within any 6 year span of time. In return for those kinds of authority, that kind of authority that they had, the states had certain restrictions. First and foremost, they could not declare war. That was a right. That was the authority of the Congress itself. And also, the states could not enter into separate treaties or alliances with foreign governments. Also, the people, the inhabitants of the states themselves, were permitted to move freely and conduct commerce freely between states. And for all this, however, there were some interests that went unrepresented. Um, this is best seen with regard to Abigail Adams and her letter to her husband, John Adams, who was a member of the Second Continental Congress. In 1776, Abigail Adams wrote that imploring her husband to remember the ladies, that there should be some sort of space provided within the governing architecture um, for women to have a place and a purpose in the public sphere. She said that all men could be tyrants if they could, meaning that women, again, should be uh, uh, exhibit themselves or be able to express themselves within public debate and such. So this is a very emblematic, you might say, of enlightened principles, and it's to be sure the American revolutionaries, specifically the kind of gentrified class of which the Adamses were a part, wanted to and bought into and kind of espoused uh, enlightened ideas. And so here, Abigail Adams, in many cases, is kind of speaking on behalf of women in the colonies, in the states, and kind of very reminiscent of the women of Europe within the Enlightenment era that we discussed in the earlier lecture. Of course, these calls with regard to the experience in the Americas, in the United States, these calls went unheeded, showing the limits of the philosophical nature of the American Revolution itself. Um, it was very, uh, it did provide for a great deal of self empowerment, but again, that would be only relegated to initially the white male population. And even then, it should be noted that white males themselves were that were able to kind of fully appreciate and take advantage of the rights provided was a minority. That they had to be members of a property class, so they had to meet several thresholds or benchmarks in order to be fully represented and have their views heard, and also participate in taking advantage of voting rights as well. So, in some respects, given all that, some historians argue that the American Revolution was something more of a conservative-like revolution. It was nothing, uh, especially in context to or in relationship to something like the French Revolution, which was seen as an inversion of the social order, where the peasantry is rising up and beginning to simply, uh, you know, uh, have its voice heard, um, you know, in such a way that there was no um, kind of intervening or moderate uh, interpretation of that. Here in the American Revolution, you still have this gentry, whether it's kind of the professionalized class, the elite kind of social slave owning class of the South and large plantation owners. These are essentially, in many respects, the segment of the American population that is guiding the revolution itself. It's not something that the commoners are determining for themselves in many respects. So the Articles of Confederation were proposed as early as 1777, but they would not be ratified by all of the states until 1781, which really demonstrates the numerous demands and complexities that were being put upon, any type of new government, or the organization of a new government by the states themselves. And there were severe problems. Congress had very few ways of collecting revenues for the task facing it. Again, it was charged with providing for the common defense of all the states, but this meant that the Constitution, or excuse me, the convention, the Congress itself, had to rustle funds from the states, and that consumed an awful lot of time and energy because the states were not necessarily forthcoming with those obligations. And this would contribute to ineffective government, inefficient government, but also demonstrate the power of the purse as well when it came to state finances and governing finances. Also, the Congress was to represent the nation on the world stage, but it was a weak and collective body rather than being a single, solitary, strong governing authority. For example, England, after the war, wanted or wondered if it needed to sign 13 separate treaties to end the Revolutionary War, a separate treaty for each of the 13 states. When it came time to nominating and sending official liaisons from other foreign powers, France, for its part, wondered if it should be sending 13 ministers, again, one for each state, or just a single minister to be represented um, at the National Congress itself. That type of um, um, you know lack of clarity meant that the Congress did not have a single voice to it in representing the states as a whole on the world stage. There was also the issue of debtors versus creditors. After the American Revolution, ending in 1783, there was a post war economic depression, a time in which the United States had to search for new trading partners. Just um, having negotiated a treaty with this new country, Britain turned to boycotting the United States, and it took time for this new country to develop new trading agreements and provide or um, win access to the established trading routes. So, as a result of this economic calamity, in the years following the revolution, foreign goods were scarce throughout the 13 states. Now, wealthy Americans that could afford imported goods um, did so, but this meant in many cases that you had money being exiting the states in order to pay for those goods. So what this meant is that money itself was in short supply, and when the circulation of money is constricted or is hard to come by, this meant that getting out of debt would be more difficult for those that were in debt. And because the money was already scarce within the United States, didn't make matters any easier or better. So as a result, merchants and moneylenders began to call in loans and debts owed to them in order to amass capital money for themselves. And this only worsened the plight of the debtors, um, resulting in property being foreclosed upon if they could not pay the outstanding outstanding debts owed upon them. Um, or to simply liquidate their estates or their property in order to raise the cash necessary to pay their debts. And that was personal debt. Within the public sphere, there was also a healthy amount of debt to be paid as well. Again, wars are expensive, and now Congress, the National Congress, was going to have to pay its war debts. Some war debts included war bonds. Again, it's a very effective way for states to raise the money necessary during wartime is to sell bonds. Um, but many of these bonds were, again, held by wealthy speculators. Only those with the money available could invest in these types of bonds. And so, as a result, in the post war years, farmers and veterans argued that the poor were paying the rich. So, the farmers, the veterans of the American Revolution, who were not as well off, now through forms like taxes or by the calling in of debts, were having to pay money to meet those obligations. In the case of the public expenses and public debt, this meant that that money was then going to be used to pay back the war bonds that were owed to these wealthier speculators. And so this becomes a class issue where the poor are paying on these war debts, paying off these war debts, so that the money can then go into the pockets of those investors that had taken up or bought bonds during the war. Congress also began to requisition funds from the states, and those states, of course, with larger populations, paid more. Some states, such as Rhode Island, simply turned to printing their own money, and because the states had control over their finances, that meant that there were 13 different currencies in circulation. And so Rhode Island simply turned on the printing press, printed off a bunch of money in their own currency to meet their obligations. What happens is that when you increase the money supply like that, you're going to lead to rocketing inflation, which is exactly what happened in the case of Rhode Island, where the currency nearly lost all its value. Other states turned to raising taxes in order to pay for more debts. One of the best examples of this occurred in Massachusetts, where property taxes rose more than 60% between the years of 1783 and 1786. So that's on average about 20% per year during that 3 year span. This was these were taxes that the local people of Massachusetts could not afford, and so as a result, the courts began to seize property on land on property that was in uh, default when it came to taxation. One such property in Massachusetts belonged to a war veteran, a man by the name of Daniel Shea. Um, Initially, the farmers and landholders within Massachusetts petitioned the state government for tax relief, but these efforts were unsuccessful. And state officials grew increasingly nervous over the potential for some sort of insurrection. And so, as a result, the state militia was called out in order to impose order. Massachusetts farmers believed that they had a right to overthrow the government because it had become oppressive over the people themselves, as had been done, just recently with regard to the British government. So again, the issue of taxation here was serving as a flashpoint, a point of friction between the people and the government. Daniel Shea, for his part, began to organize his fellow farmers and war veterans. And on January 25th of 1787, Shea's followers tried to seize control of a local armory in order to arm themselves and gain, access to artillery and gunpowder. The state militia, the Massachusetts militia, was able to drive off the farmers. In the process, they killed four farmers and wounded 20. The significance of Shays' rebellion here, as it's often referred to, demonstrated that this young country um, needed a new form of government, um, where political power was more centralized in the hands of a federal authority, which is why, beginning later on in the year of 1787, you begin to have the Constitutional Convention um, from about May to September of that year. The Constitutional Convention was held, and a process of trying to figure out and draft a constitutional system was hammered out during that process. I'll get to that in just a few moments. I did want to mention, however, that there were some successes that occurred under the Articles of Confederation. One of the best examples of this occurs with what's known as the passage, the installment of what's known as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So, as a result of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War, it was the peace agreement that Britain had with the United States. Land was granted to the new United States, which included all lands south of Canada, north of the 31st parallel, basically, you might say the northern border of what is today the state of Florida, and east of the Mississippi River. So the United States won a pretty hefty land mass for itself. And the Ordinance of 1787 was a culmination of a long debate within the National Congress under the Articles of Confederation, determining what to do with the lands between the 13 states, and the Mississippi River. The National Congress was able to sell the land for as little as $1 an acre. This would be used to help create revenue for itself in order to pay off wartime debts, create revenue for the National Congress to pay its debts. So it didn't necessarily have to rely so much on the states. It's kind of one way to bypass that. And this ordinance also benefited, because land was so cheap, it benefited land speculators who began to buy land and then turn it around and resell it at greater cost for greater profit for themselves. For better or worse, many of these speculators were actually members of Congress themselves, the National Congress. Through this ordinance, Congress declared that slavery would not be permitted north of the Ohio River, which is basically the northern border, or the border between what is today Kentucky and the states of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. However, fugitive slaves, if they should escape and make their way across the Ohio River, they were eligible to be returned to their rightful owners in the South. Also, the ordinance decreed that only 3 to 5 new states would emerge from what was known or increasingly referred to as the Northwest Territory. And you can see that here in this slide, in this graphic here, the dark blue states, those being Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. This was to limit democracy and the political influence that these potential Western states could wield on the rest of the existing 13 states. It also established how and why settlers needed to hold significant amounts of property or land in order to be eligible to vote. Again, a very common threshold even within the original 13 states themselves. Again, restricting democracy and participation within the government. All settlers would be provided with the same rights as those in the states, so that people living in these territories would have the right to trial by jury, religious freedom, and so on and so forth. It also slowed and kind of spelled out the process for admitting these territories as potentially new states within the United States, making it an orderly process. And it provided actually the territories with a way of becoming states. That those thresholds included having a local resident population within these territories that totaled or exceeded 60,000 people. Um, these territories would be provided with representation within the National Congress. Again, looking for a balance between various interests, North, South, and the Western interests. Um, Territorial governments, as they when they were territories, the legislatures of those territories would be comprised of locally elected officials, but the governors of the territories would be appointed by the National Congress. Many of these guidelines served as the guidelines that would remain in place up until as late as 1959, when Hawaii and Alaska became the last two states to round out the 50 states of the United States. But by 1787, even with successes like the Northwest Ordinance, there were the instability, the insurrections like Shays' Rebellion, that meant that new attention would be paid to creating a new version of national leadership, which gets us to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and the process of consolidating greater amounts of political authority within the federal structure. This is where we get the what we know to be the U.S. Constitution today, obviously operating under the three main branches: the judicial, legislative, and executive branches. The judicial branch with its Supreme Court, the legislative branch with its bicameral U.S. Senate and U.S. House of Representatives, and the presidency operating under the executive or embodying the executive branch. What's interesting about the whole process of the convention itself and the constitutional model is the emphasis being put on checks and balances. That no one branch could usurp the other two. Each had checks over the other, um, and it all revolved around laws. The executive branch executed the laws, upheld the law, enforced the law. The legislature, of course, passed legislation making new laws, and the judiciary would adjudicate the law, determine what laws were applicable, how they were to be interpreted. That was all part of the judiciary. This allowed various interests also to be voiced and balanced, one against each other, which promoted a sense of compromise and interdependency, not only between the states themselves, but also between the states and the federal government. This was done, of course, to instill order. It was done in a representational way. And it was done in a way that was not necessarily democratic against, those that were eligible to participate in voting represented a small fraction of the overall society itself during this period of time, the early years uh, of the young republic. So this really kind of gets us to a pretty good place as far as understanding the U.S. experience in the first decades of as it tried to experiment with and grapple with self government. It was by no means a well organized or kind of um, you know uh, it was more of a trial and error type of endeavor. But this is the by 1789, when enough states managed to ratify the new U.S. Constitution, is when it would take effect, and that's what will um, that's the system, of course, what we have today, which has proved remarkably resilient based on, again, compromise to a great degree. So that gets us through the American Revolution and its early republic. Um, I'll be talking about others, kind of world events coming up in future lectures. So be on the lookout for that. All right. Take care.